Hello everyone, LaFinci here. Today, we will be exploring a timeline where the ancient Greek religion, more specifically Pythagoreanism, survived into the modern era. Although Pythagoras is now known for his contributions to mathematics, in our timeline, he led a religious movement in the Calabrian city of Croton called Pythagoreanism, which expressed their devotion to the Hellenistic gods through numerology, mathematics, music, and the practice of an austere life. They also had beliefs around metempsychosis, reincarnation, and abstained from eating meat and beans. This movement even had a significant part in the conquest of the neighboring city of Sybaris under Croton. However, Pythagoreanism would meet a short end after Cylon, being rejected from the religious order, launched a revolt against them, killing many of its followers, and Pythagoras would die shortly after. Although his philosophy would inform the Greco-Roman philosophers of the Neo-Pythagorean movement from the 1st century BC to 2nd century AD, Pythagoras today is mainly remembered for the Pythagorean theorem rather than as a prophet. In this timeline, the Pythagorean movement would be more open to new conversion to the faith, allowing the Pythagoreans to remain in power of Croton and for Pythagoras to further guide the faith as the prophet of what would be purported as a reformist movement of the ancient Greek religion, and thus turning the religion into a more evangelistic faith and expanding from its core in Croton and the conquered city of Sybaris. During the archaic era of Greece, Pythagoreanism would spread through Magna Graecia, through conversion, establishment of new colonies, and conquests, with Pythagoras justifying war as a method of self-defense and to combat hedonism in certain non-believing communities. The communal austere lifestyle endorsed by Pythagorean teachings would serve to strengthen societal cohesion through Greek cities in the region, ensuring the endurance of Pythagoreanism across Greek communities across southern Italy and Sicily by Pythagoras' death. Pythagoreanism would spread to Greece through trade across the Ionian, establishing small communities throughout Attica, Boeotia, and Laconia. Sometime after the death of Pythagoras, there would begin to be greater conflicts between the two schools of Pythagoreanism, the akosmatikoi, those who listened, and the mathematikoi, those who learned, around how to best escape the cycle of metempsychosis and ultimately join the gods in the afterlife. The akosmatikoi were the more dogmatic tradition, stressing the study of mysticism, numerology, and a more literal interpretation of the akosmata, verbal sayings of Pythagoras and the golden verses, while the mathematikoi expressed their more progressive views of the faith through the study of mathematics, science, and music, likely to preserve the mathematical and philosophical works of Pythagoras. While many Pythagoreans would view both akosmatic and mathematic Pythagoreanism as compatible and held beliefs from both schools, more devout akosmatics may separate into isolated communities, viewing the scientific and philosophical innovations of the mathematics as heretical, with some greater cities veering towards one tradition than the other. As the god of music and knowledge, Apollo was the primary god worshipped by the Pythagoreans, using mathematics and music as a way of communicating and worshipping him among other gods. I can see Pythagoreanism turning into a henotheistic religion, while acknowledging the existence of the other gods, would primarily center Apollo in rituals and worship. Other gods like Demeter, Poseidon, and Zeus would be worshipped through regional cult centers. The Roman conquest of Magna Graecia would bring in many Latin converts in southern Italy, and the expansion of the Roman Empire in Carthage and Greece would aid in the greater expansion of the religion throughout the Mediterranean. The influx of Latin settlers into southern Italy throughout the century would result in the creation of hybrid Greco-Romance cultures by the early Middle Ages in Calabria. In around 30 AD, a Jewish man by the name of Yeshua ben Yosef was executed for claiming to be the Messiah and Son of God. 3 days later, it was alleged that he rose from the dead, This would greatly affect the history of Pythagoreanism in the next 2 millennia. The rise of Christianity would inevitably put them at odds with Pythagoreans, seeing them as idolaters to be converted. Conversely, the Pythagoreans would see the Christians as a superstitious, backwards group, disagreeing on everything from the nature of the afterlife, the role of women in society, the morality of homosexuality and meat-eating, and acceptable forms of worship, all the way to arguing on whether beings contain the souls of the dead. Thus, the two religions will be in constant conflict over dominance in the Mediterranean. During the Roman period of persecution of Christians, some Pythagoreans could aid in the capture and destruction of early Christian communities, under the guise of moral superiority to them. There would definitely be numerous conflicts between Christian and Pythagorean communities, with churches, temples, and statues being vandalized and destroyed by people in both religious groups. Despite this, some concepts, such as Christian views of forgiveness, could be gradually adopted into Pythagoreanism as Christianity takes hold in the Roman Empire. Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity and the Edict of Milan would see a shift in power that would see Pythagoreanism's position in southern Italy challenged, as the Roman Empire would actively try to phase out the old pre-Abrahamic religions of the empire, including Pythagoreans, who would be seen as idolaters and deviants. The further persecution of Pythagoreans under subsequent Roman emperors would have likely led to the rebellion and secession of many Pythagorean majority regions such as Calabria, Campania, and Sicily, as the empire would split in two under Theodosius I. These rebellions could spread into Greece, Africa, and even in the city of Rome itself, with varying amounts of success, greatly damaging the military and general integrity of the Western Roman Empire, and likely leading to an earlier collapse of Western Rome, as several Germanic nations like the Goths, Franks, and Vandals would migrate into Western Europe, leaving Magna Graecia independent, while the Greek Pythagoreans would likely diminish under Christianization for the Eastern Roman Empire. These Pythagorean states would likely settle into a republican governmental model, with Pythagoras himself regarding pure democracy as an inherently chaotic idea destined to fail. Against the increasingly authoritarian autocracy of the Romans, many independent states in southern Italy would use a council of representatives elected by local citizens to deliberate on collective decision-making, along with the use of oracles, which would guide both everyday and political decisions by seeking guidance from Apollo himself. The citizenry would consist of all adult native-born people excluding slaves. This would include women. In regards to the role of women in society, Pythagoreanism would be ahead of its time in comparison to dominant Hellenistic and Abrahamic practices. According to tradition, Pythagoras' own wife, Theano, and daughters, Demo, Maia, and Origenite, were important philosophers in the inner circle of the early faith. Pythagorean societies would allow women to study, philosophize, and even hold religious and state offices, while being wives and mothers as well. This could create a basis for possible gender-equal states, which could lead to an earlier sprout of feminist movements, as expansions of women's rights might extend into Europe and the Near East. Post-Roman collapse, the Pythagorean states would have to contend with the Ostrogoths and later the Lombards, attempting to unify the peninsula as well as Christianize its southern inhabitants. The Lombard Duchy of Benevento would eat into the Pythagorean realms as far as Calabria and Salento. They would also have to contend with attempted reconquests from Justinian's Byzantine Empire in the east, also seeking to reclaim Italy. These would probably be more successful with southern Italy coming under Byzantine rule before revolting again after the Lombard invasion under Justin II. During the early Middle Ages, Slavic peoples would come into southern Italy as slaves, as the Pythagorean states would be an instrumental element of the Venetian and other Mediterranean slave trades. During this time, Magna Graecia would also attract a large Jewish diaspora as, Unlike the Christian realms, Pythagorean societies wouldn't have a pretense for anti-Semitism. Due to this, Jews would also be allowed to pursue much more careers and lifestyles than the few options they had in other places such as moneylending, allowing many Jewish populations to integrate further into Magna Graecan society. Due to the religion's focus on mathematical and scientific research as a way of breaking the cycle of reincarnation, several universities would be founded throughout the Mediterranean and eventually other parts of Europe, with moves made in the Pythagorean world to establish a public education system for all children regardless of class. This would add to the Greco-Roman and Islamic intellectual traditions and leading advancements in mathematics, the natural sciences, the arts, and philosophy rhetoric. Jewish, along with Christian and Muslim citizens that would come from the rise of the Caliphate in the Mediterranean, would also be the main consumers and importers of meat and animals into Magna Graecia due to the vegetarian lifestyle of the Pythagoreans. Pythagoreans held the belief that causing unnecessary harm and suffering to animals was immoral in all circumstances except self-defense. Thus, the consumption and production of meat would be extremely frowned upon, likened to murder, and the slaughter of animals would be made illegal in most of the Pythagorean world, leading to most meat and animals being imported with a few exceptions for nations with large Abrahamic populations, such as Sicily and Amalfi. Moving into the High Middle Ages, its greater access to Greek and Muslim medical knowledge and generally higher standards of cleanliness would mean the Pythagorean world will fare slightly better during the Black Death compared to most of Europe. Their preservation of Greco-Roman works could also lead to the Renaissance happening earlier in the Mediterranean, sure to be aided by the invention of the printing press. With the collapse of the Angelid Byzantines to the Fourth Crusade, along with Catholic nobles, I could see the Pythagorean republics taking over chunks of Greece, seeing it as a reclamation of the traditional Greek homeland, and to preserve ancient Greek holy sites, Delphi, Mount Olympus, and Samos, with many of the republics vying for control of Greece, with the Catholic nobles likely compounding, with crusades likely being coordinated from the papacy up north, to stamp out the perceived idolatry of Magna Graecia. Along with Greece, Albania would come under Pythagorean control as well, with the religion spreading there as well as Pythagorean-controlled Greece. With the religion expanding outside of the Greek culture, I can expect a separate Illyric sect of Pythagoreanism to emerge, with the veneration of Albanian gods and Kanun of Albanian paganism integrated into an Albanized sect of the religion. Some Albanian groups farther from the homeland, like the Aberetia and Arvanites, would retain a more Hellenic style of the religion. The further infighting of Pythagorean and Catholic-owned Greece would leave the area more vulnerable to conquest by the Turkic states of Anatolia, possibly the Ottomans. Seeing a return to marginalization of Greek Pythagoreans under Muslim rule, who would likely face greater persecution as perceived committers of shirk, idolatry and polytheism, as opposed to other people of the book such as Christians and Jews. While the rise of the Enlightenment in Europe would strengthen attitudes towards women's rights, animal rights, and destigmatization of homosexuality, the communal lifestyles of many Pythagorean communities, however, would come into conflict with the rise of individualism, having to reconsider their views on collective property ownership and resource distribution. If the Greeks managed to gain back independence like in our timeline, Pythagoreanism might see a revival in the country as Greek nationalism could revive interest in traditional Greek religion, along with the contributions of other plurality Pythagorean groups like the Arvanitica and Aromanians. Pythagoreans could also be used to promote a pan-Hellenic identity between Hellas and Magna Graecia, through shared theological and cultural heritage, possibly promoting unification between the two. Especially as Italian nationalism would likely seek the unification of their peninsula, making the Magna Grecian Pythagoreans more geopolitically vulnerable. Pythagoreans would likely remain a culturally significant minority in Greece, numbering around 10 to 20%. During this time, a prominent Pythagorean diaspora would form internationally as groups like Sicilians, Neapolitans, and Albanians would move to rising powers in the Western world such as the USA, Australia, and Brazil. These immigrant groups would likely face religious marginalization from the Christian-dominated governments and be forced to assimilate early on, being treated as a separate racial category from white Europeans due to their cultural and religious differences. This would likely wane as many settler states of the late 20th century began adopting multiculturalism. At this point, it would be hard to predict what specifically would happen in the 2,700 years since the religion's inception, but the world would likely be more scientifically advanced as the religion's emphasis on mathematics and education would invariably lead to a multitude of discoveries in maths and science being made way earlier. However, we would also see a unique view of mathematics as virtually inseparable from numerology, mysticism, and religion as a whole, providing a fundamentally different framework of understanding mathematics. With the Pythagoreans surviving into the modern day, we would see an entirely different framework of society, understanding of reality, and our relationship to the world from the Abrahamic worldview. Here is the final product.